this, with working at a home studio, there's no meter running, you can work forever, and just sort of like, it was hard to sort of be like, we're done. Let's just start mixing, or it was just, let's do one more song, let's do this. And then, I can imagine that was one of the early things that was done. It was a lot of months. It took a lot of months to do that record.
Well, it's interesting because I know that it drove Ed nuts that Ted used to call I'll Wait Argent's Hold Your Head Up. It used to drive Ed nuts because Ed used to play I'll Wait without the lyrics, and he would sing Hold Your Head Up by Argent to him playing I'll Wait, and it used to make Eddie nutty. And I don't know, I read that in many interviews, and that it used to bother him when he did that. I also found it interesting in the book that Ed built 5150, and Ted was surprised that he wanted to record 1984 there because, obviously, Ed was, building it because he wanted to expand and become his own home studio and his own production company there.
Right.
It's shocking to me that that's so surprising to Ted because it was clear that Eddie really wanted to take control. And it's also interesting that it was physically made so that Ted would be uncomfortable. I mean, he described it in the book as being in a bathtub.
Well, I don't think it was physically made to make him uncomfortable. I just think it's a small building, right? It was. Yeah, I don't think that's the way it's characterized in the book. It was just a small building, a small space. And the other thing I will tell you is that I asked Don Landry this directly in the last year or so. Don said to me, I didn't think we were going to do the record there either. When Ed and Al said that, or Ed said it to me, I was actually pretty surprised too. I was like, really?
Wow.
It wasn't finished, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't finished.
No, yeah, it was in construction phase.
Right. So it wasn't finished. And so, maybe that had been a long-term goal. The idea they were going to do 1984 there seemed to surprise Don as well. And in addition, I think Ted really goes to great pains to talk about how amazing Don's technical ability is to be able to build this studio from the ground up. And he rewired the board and he built that studio and how it had an incredibly unique sound. But there were things that were made it uncomfortable for the way Ted liked to work. But it wasn't as if it was made that way, to make Ted uncomfortable. It was just that it was small. You couldn't track live drums there, and there was, no real space in the control room. It's tiny. It was a home studio, and that was the thing that Ted, I think, went to pains in the book to try to make clear is that he was happy that Ed was building the studio. He wanted him to build a studio because he thought this guy is an incredible writer and deserves to have a place where he can really, really work on his music and kind of work on his demos and make these sophisticated demos. But, like Ted said, it's like going from Sunset Sound, which is a world-class studio, and then you want to make it in a backyard studio. It's no offense against the backyard studio. It's a great home studio, but it's not a professional top-of-the-line studio that Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, you go through everyone, the Beach Boys, all recorded at Sunset Sound. Like, why would we record at 5150 when we could record at Sunset Sound? Of course, we understand, right, the power play and the dynamic of the, sort of, it's Ed's studio, and Ed saw it as his home, and but in the beginning, as Ted tried to make clear too, everyone was trying to make it work. Like everyone was like, okay, we'll do it, let's make it work, and it just became a challenging environment.
Yeah, and I was kind of surprised at that because with Ted being an executive, couldn't Warner Brothers have said, no, there's no way we're recording the next album in your backyard studio. We're going to a professional studio, and that's how we're doing it.
Yeah, I think he could have. Again, this is sort of my supposition, is that, then again, it's like slapping Ed and Don in the face, though, right? And that's the thing I think that Ted really struggled with, is that he was like, holy shit, this is really cool. It's just isn't the place I think we should make a record. And Ed was so proud of it. Don was proud of it. And Ted, like he said, he was up there during the course of the, being like, oh, this is interesting. You guys are doing this. This is cool. This is going to be great for Ed. I think part of the thing was that Ed felt really impassioned about wanting to do it up there, and that Don had built the studio, right? So to be like, oh, it's not good enough. It wasn't that it wasn't good enough. It just was, Ted didn't feel it was well suited for making a Van Halen studio record. He didn't think it wasn't, you weren't capable of getting a good sound up there, or a cool sound. It wasn't necessarily a sound that Ted loved, but let's all face it. 1984 is an incredible sounding record. It's all made at 5150.
Absolutely. It's incredible that you hear all the strife behind it, and it really came out beautiful. It really came out amazing. What's also amazing to me is he actually thought that after 5150 and Eat 'Em and Smile and the success of both of those, that Dave was still going to come back to Van Halen?
He told me that, yeah, he thought that, again, I don't think he necessarily thought like it's a slam dunk, but I think what he was hoping was that there would be a stepping back by everybody going, okay, we did this, let's get back together. Think about what happened with the Stones in the 80s, right? There was, the Rolling Stones never quote unquote break up, but Jagger did his solo records, and you have Keith Richards and Jagger sniping each other. This would have been like 85, 86, like, really saying like nasty things about each other. But then they get back together, they do Steel Wheels. I think that's what Ted was getting at, that he was sure that, like, both records did well. Nobody's coming to the other person like begging back, right? No one has to be like, oh, you only want to come back because your last album sucked. No one had to say that. We need you back. It wasn't that situation. You thought, okay, Eat 'Em and Smile. It was a kick-ass record. It did incredibly well. 5150, those guys did what they wanted, and he was hoping that Sammy would just step out of the picture, and not to blame Sammy for it, but it's just basically that's what he thought. But he was like, you know what? Everybody kind of dug in their heels, and he was legitimately shocked, I think, that it just went on. Like, just amazed that it went on decade after decade, that those guys couldn't kind of find a way to make it work. You know what I mean?
One thing you don't mention in the book is his reaction to Skyscraper. Did he ever talk to you about that?
He kind of washed his hands of it. I mean, I think he was just pretty unhappy that he had been cut out of the picture there. I mean, look, he talked to me at great length about what a genius he thinks Steve Vai is. And of course, obviously he's a fan of Dave's, but he never really, he would just sort of be like, never listen to it. And, for whatever reason, that's what he said to me. And, maybe I'm sure back in 1988, he listened to it, but I don't think he revisited it, probably because it reminded him of the fact that, it was an unpleasant business exchange in that whole thing that didn't work out to his advantage, or, artistic, that he really wanted to work on the next record with Dave. That was the plan.
Well, that's for sure. I don't think it would have turned out the way it did. Now, do you feel like he felt a sense of competition with Van Halen when working on Eat 'Em and Smile? Ted, I mean.
Ted didn't ever couch it to me that way. I mean, I think he felt like, he knew. He actually had told me one time he went over to, it's kind of a funny story. He went over to the Roth mansion, and this would have been after Van Halen split for a few months, and it was, obviously Sam was in the band and everything, and he went over there, and he said, like, they were all wearing fatigues, or like Pete and Dave were wearing fatigues, and they had like a table laid out, and like it was like, they were like in a war room or something like that, like maps on the wall. Like it was like David, like he was like 100% serious, and he told me this story. He's like, it was like, so Dave certainly saw it as like, he was like in this war mindset. He was like, just Dave always did kind of off the wall things, obviously. So Ted didn't really like think it was that off the wall.
Right.
But he said, he like these like maps on the wall, and like to basically have the dining room laid out like a war room in a movie. Like, or here's where we're gonna invade. We're gonna invade Cleveland, and then we're gonna whatever. Like he was saying, like with the tour and everything they were gonna do, and making the movie or whatever. We're gonna do the movie, and then we're gonna do this kind of this whole strategy. I think the sense was for Ted that he wanted to make a really kick-ass sounding record, only to make sure, in terms of competition, I guess, I don't know if it's the right word for competition, to make sure that Ed and Al didn't think like, oh, Dave's just into that sort of like, California Girls and all this other soft, like basically that we don't want Dave back in the band because he's going to do like Just Gigolo, right? That he wanted to make sure it was a hard rock. There was stuff on it that was really, really over the top hard rock.
Right.
That would be like, there'd be no doubt that no one would be confused as to whether David Lee Roth was still committed to hard rock for the sake of Van Halen going forward. I think that's really what Ted would tell you, is that it was just, he wanted to be like, he wanted the guys in Van Halen to go, Shy Boy, that's pretty kick ass. Just to be able to be like, I guess Dave still does want to do like heavy metal or whatever, that type of stuff, along with the sort of the goofier stuff he did. So I think that was really what Ted's mindset was, that he wanted to set up. I mean, he said it to me over and over. I just wanted to set those guys up to get back together. I wanted to make this kick-ass rock record that would just really, make sure that everybody in the world, including the guys in Van Halen, knowing that Dave had his shit together and was still committed to the type of music that Van Halen always done. I mean, and you guys said it at the beginning of the interview that Eat 'Em and Smile is like the 7th Van Halen record. I mean, I think there's some truth to that it's much more in the spirit of Diver Down or, Women and Children First in some sort of way than 5150, if that makes sense. And that was what Ted wanted to do with it.
For example, you listen to Drop Dead Legs and then you listen to Love Walks In. But you listen to Drop Dead Legs and you listen to Bump and Grind, and it does sound like it's the next record. You know what I mean? It's got that kind of vibe. So now, in terms of the name change from Van Halen to Van Hagar, thinking about that, it's very interesting that Ted was very pro Van Hagar, because typically in a company, they don't like to change the name of a brand. And especially after seeing AC/DC kind of continue with a new singer, right, you think that Warner Brothers would be pushing to keep the name Van Halen because of its worth.
Yeah, except if you thought, again, this isn't just me thinking about it with you now, is that, unless you thought the album was going to flop, right? I mean, that's the thing. It's like thinking about, did Black Sabbath damage its brand by some of the records those guys made in the 90s with, when basically before they got back with Ozzy or Dio.
Yeah,
I mean,
the Headless Cross, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I like some of those records, but they're certainly not. I mean, you look at those records, you're like, yeah, I mean, they're not really as good as, I think that's a perfectly fair point, and I think that I'm sure if you sat Ted down and he said that to him, he'd probably be like, yeah, that's a fair point. For him, it was a pretty emotional thing, and he felt, like you can't have the Stones without Mick and Keith. I mean, that's the same type of thing where you just be like, oh, I'm going to get Roger Daltrey to sing. Well, no, it's not the Stones. It's Roger Daltrey singing in the Rolling Stones band. And so that was the same type of thing. So I think that's where Ted really was coming from a very emotional, artistic state, rather than going sort of monetarily going, yeah, I mean, obviously, if you want to put it out, I mean, obviously, since it ended up being a Van Halen record, I'm sure the guys at people in Warner Brothers ultimately were like, well, there's obviously a very good side to that, meaning the executives throughout the company, because that's the brand. But, if people had come out and not accepted Sammy, then you would have damaged the Van Halen brand in theory. And I think that's what Ted's probably thought process was, especially if he's thinking like, okay, these guys, this is going to blow over. They're going to do the record, and then Dave will come back. So let's call it the Van Hagar or the Sammy Halen project or something like that, and just get those guys. You guys know this. That was never going to happen. Right. The brothers would have had a hunger strike inside of 5150 before they would let that happen.
Exactly.
To their credit, that's what their name, it's their band. I totally understand where they're coming from, and so it was never going to happen. It was just Ted's response to the situation going, I'll do it if you do this. And
well, unfortunately, Dave let that happen because he's the one who suggested the name Van Halen. Had the band been named Mammoth, this wouldn't have been the discussion, because there wouldn't have been some personal attachment to the name Mammoth, and maybe Dave would have owned a piece of the name Mammoth. Maybe he could have gone off and taken off with Mammoth. I mean, honest to God, it's really kind of unfair that the band is called Van Halen, and then it's like, well, it's my band because it's my name and fuck you. Like Bon Jovi is interesting because John is the one who owned the record contract. John was signed and no one else was signed. Everybody else was signed on as John's backup band. So you kind of give it there. But Van Halen does have the mixture of Dave and Ed. And for Christ's sake, back in the day, the joke used to be that people used to call Dave Van, for Christ's sake. I mean, that was all part of the whole scene there. But anyway, Greg, we've exhausted you enough. We want to thank you so much for being so patient and answering all our questions in regards to the book. Funny enough, folks, this is only 160 pages of the 460-page book. So, of course, this is a Van Halen podcast, and we're going to focus on the Van Halen side. But Greg does an incredible job weaving in and out of the different artists that Mr. Templeman produced. And my God, he really produced some great artists, like he mentions, the Doobie Brothers and Nicolette Larson and Little Feat. He also even he touches on the Bullet Boys a little bit, Montrose, of course, Sammy Hagar. The list goes on and on. So, Greg, this was a fantastic job. We really appreciate you coming back on. You're always a welcome guest, and we wish you the best of luck with the book. Now, here's the good news, Greg. People are home during this pandemic. So what do they need to do? They need to read, Greg. They need to get back to basics and to read a good quality book. And what's better than picking up Ted Templeman, A Platinum Producer's Life and Music, available on Amazon. All this month, we are promoting this book, and we are very excited about it. We've been talking about it for quite some time. Mr. Renoff, I have one last question for you. I know that you've just put out this book, and we want to ask you, are you working on something next yet? Have you put another pot on the burner?
I do have another pot on the burner. My current pot on the burner is homeschooling my children while they are out.
Yes, of course. For Greg has
next 2 months.
Yes, Greg has 2 beautiful daughters. But in addition to your parental duties, is there any other thing that you're writing?
I have another Van Halen book in me. I will tell you guys that, all this sort of this craziness has gone and sort of reorganized my calendar for the coming weeks, including, unfortunately, the whole promotion schedule that was going to be involved with having Ted do stuff in Pasadena and stuff like that when the book came out.
Right.
Because everyone's all buttoned up. I do have another Van Halen book in me. It would obviously, I think, focus on the period that would cover some of the Sammy Hagar stuff too. That's I think really ripe, especially after I did this book. I'm really ripe to kind of get into that stuff, that muddled middle period that we've been talking about, like what happened here, what happened there. So if I was going to do another book, it would probably be focused on that period of time. But that's all, as I said, it's all kind of been shelved for the time being because it's, any hope for doing a book proposal and stuff like that, that sort of has to kind of, God willing, this will all be over before too much longer. But it's looking like it's going to be a couple of